We are scheduled this morning to meet with the Minister of Public Enterprises on matters that we have been dealing with. The background really, Minister, is that on the 26th of April, we met with the former CEO of Eskom, Mr. Tereta, following the television interview he had with ANC, which aired on the 23rd of February. As we've reiterated in all the meetings that we have had, the allegations, some of which were new, some of which are things were already in the public domain, we were affair with, you were dealing with, and so on, largely related to corruption and criminal activity and maladministration at Eskom. We spoke about breaches of the PFMA, and as you know, we have met with Eskom more than any other entity, and they've conducted 2 oversight visits to Eskom. So we are here this morning because then Mr. Tereta made several references to engagements that he had, or alleges to have had, with the Minister of Public Enterprises, wherein amongst others he shared information about the alleged corruption and criminal activity at the power utility, including but not limited to the naming of the now known as senior politician, insofar as the activities of corruption were concerned at Eskom. So this meeting is to allow the minister to exercise his right to respond and react to issues that have been raised. So it's an exercise of the alterum partem, and for colleagues then to engage with the minister on the issues that are there. I know that there's other things that are happening in the public domain about these things, but would not want to go there. The issues are around really what Mr. Tereta has said. We have met with the National Commissioner of Police, we've met with the Hawks, we've met with the board of Eskom, the former chairperson of the board, and we will in due course be meeting with the advisor to the president, Dr. Mufamadi, as well. So, colleagues, what we'll do, we'll hand over to the minister, and the deputy minister has indicated that he will need to join the portfolio committee on public enterprises, because SAA matters are being dealt with that side this morning concurrently to this meeting. So, but he thought he would start here, so we understand that you'll have to leave DM. So, colleagues, we'll hand over to the minister, and he will address the committee and raise these issues, and then we will then take questions after that. So, Minister, good morning, and over to you.
Good morning, Chair, and honourable members of SCOPA. And thank you for this opportunity, as you say, under the Audi Alterum Partem notion, to respond to many of the assertions that have been made by various people. And as a preliminary comment, let me indicate that you undertake this inquiry in a context where clearly load shedding is harming the economy, investment in the economy, and disrupting the lives of millions of citizens. And very understandably, lots of people are very upset with Eskom and its performance at this point in time. State capture, as we've said to you on many occasions, has damaged SOEs very significantly. And today we can crystallize it, as some experts have done for us, in what is called the plant, the people, and process issues. And each of them has a multiplicity of subtopics that you can look at, and some you've looked at as SCOPA in the past, and other committees of Parliament have looked at it as well. There's no doubt that there is also, and I think the public should be aware of this, a link between corruption, sabotage, and load shedding. Although one cannot say that these factors are entirely responsible, there are a variety of other factors that intervene as well. Corruption plays a big part in what we see today, both corruption in the past and corruption that is taking place at present. It is also a time where we are a year or so away from the next general election in South Africa. So, as you clearly have pointed out, there's a lot going out in the public domain where fake political narratives, character assassinations, and all sorts of things are being said about individuals or collection of individuals or organizations. And that context or element of the context should not be forgotten as well. From the little I've heard while I've been away about some of the proceedings here, clearly it is also the governing party that is under attack. And of course it suits the purposes of electioneering to be in that mode. What we do require, however, is to set aside the politics from making Eskom work. And as I've said on many occasions before, the issue of electricity and energy, and indeed the consequences of load shedding, should be a mobilizing factor for all political parties, all organizations, and citizens at large as well. Government's expectations, as are the expectations of South Africans, of Eskom, are fairly clear. They want the electricity that they have been so used to, as citizens elsewhere in the world demand the same of the utilities, whether they are state-run and owned, or whether they are privately run and owned. They want efficient operations within the current generation fleet, and where it is clear that these efficient operations are not taking place, something must be done about them by those that are in positions of responsibility. We also, at the same time, have become acutely aware, both as a world and as South Africans, that we are undertaking a very serious energy transition, and that transition must be undertaken soberly and within the context of our own conditions in South Africa as we make our contribution to minimizing the negative impacts of climate change. We've got to, and we expect Eskom over the past years, subsequent to the state capture period, to rebuild the expertise and professionalism of management and the operational staff. And that should have been the focus of those in charge. We needed, as part of the process element of the 3 Ps, to re-inculcate engineering disciplines in the processes at the plant. We needed, as many have said, including our own Treasury, to ensure that this organization once again reaches a point of financial stability and sustainability. And in doing so, the state has made its contribution by reducing the debt of Eskom and taking over some of that debt, but also expecting Eskom to seriously look at its expense structure and to cut costs in a way in which it would not harm the operations of the organization, but at the same time contribute to financial stability. It is also expected of Eskom that on a daily basis, systems, processes, the appropriate technologies would be put in place, which is well within the capability of any management of any institution of this type, to ensure that Corruption in the procurement processes in particular, which would be of particular concern to SCOPA, must be dealt with, analyzed, and traced to its origins to the extent possible. It's quite clear, Chairperson, that whilst what I call State Capture 1 has been concluded, and although many are still to face the consequences of that, State Capture 2 in different forms and on a smaller scale, but perhaps even with significant amount of money is being lost, is pretty much at play. And I've referred publicly to Mpumalanga being a crime scene on many occasions. So there's nothing new that has been added to this discourse or any insights into exactly what is going on at this point in time. Above all, the responsibility of both management and board, and indeed ourselves, and SCOPA as well, is to ensure that the good governance is in place, that to the extent possible, every member of staff has the appropriate level of ethics and integrity in their conduct, and that proper risk management systems are in place as well. Clearly, as SCOPA, you have a responsibility in terms of your terms of reference and mandate by Parliament to look at these and other factors and ensure to the extent possible that there's accountability, but more important, delivery on these aspects as well. It is in this instance that I want to reiterate the commitment of myself and our department to parliamentary accountability and to be helpful in executing the mandate of SCOPA. As the TOR, or terms of reference of SCOPA, indicates, I look forward, and that many would, to recommendations from SCOPA that would assist in strengthening the financial and risk management systems and improve the governance systems within institutions like Eskom itself. In the recent past, as a result of these interviews and so on, the impression has been created that it's only in the last few weeks that South Africans have discovered that corruption is rife in institutions like Eskom. So to remind all of us, I've, with the assistance of the department, compiled a number of documents for you. Some of them have been emailed to you, but there's 2 leverage files, Chair, that I will hand to you, to remind ourselves that corruption has been around for a long time. Some elements of corruption have been dealt with. Other elements of corruption still need to be dealt with. But we need to recognize that as far back as 2017, the same Parliamentary Committee on Public Enterprises, of which I was a part at that time, held an inquiry into Eskom, and its report was adopted by the National Assembly late in 2018. In 2019, we are all familiar with both the processes but the outcomes of the Zondo Commission and its inquiry into institutions like Eskom and the extent to which state capture damaged the institution. There have been any number of SIU proclamations and investigations, and it's good to see that the SIU head, Mr. Motiwe, is here, that would give you an indication of work that has been concluded, but work that is still to be concluded in this particular regard. Institutions like Eskom itself have also undertaken forensic investigations of their own. So there's any number of reports that are available, both in relation to the past, but some in relation to the current period as well. For example, the supply of fuel oil to Eskom. So all these presentations and reports are in the files that I've indicated we will hand to you. I want to once again indicate that corruption is not going to be eliminated or minimized by engaging in what one might call politicking at this particular point in time. It requires boldness, it requires courage, it requires a principled approach in terms of opposition to corruption, and whatever the origins of corruption or the corruptors might be, in terms of any affiliation institutionally or political party, those who are found to be corrupt, against whom there is sufficient evidence to ensure that the law enforcement agencies will act in an appropriate way, must be dealt with by the law. We are also familiar, Chairperson, that whilst there is this word corruption, it embraces a number of different types of activities. So the sabotage that takes place as a result of mixing coal with stones at power stations like Majuba, the consequent destruction or damage to mills, so that contractors that are required to repair the mills have a constant stream of work, the trucking industry that sometimes line up a couple of hundred trucks outside of a power station to deliver coal, rather than have conveyor belts conveying that coal. The contractors who are involved in one or other capacity, particularly in respect of maintenance of units of power stations. And one can go on to many different aspects like that. Each of those has good people in those positions and services, but there are also those who want to make, inverted commas, a quick buck in the process as well. Some of them have been identified, some of them have been dealt with, and more will be identified, and more of them will be dealt with as the NICOM processes begin to gather more momentum. And they are certainly doing some very interesting work at this point in time. There are a number of other assertions that have been made in that interview that you referred to and elsewhere. I'm going to respond to some of them. Eskom is not just a feeding trough for the ANC, as the former CEO alleges. There have been instances where there's been a link, and one can't deny that, between institutions like Chancellor House and some of the projects that have been undertaken. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that multinational institutions like ABB, SAP, local companies like Trillion, and the construction companies with whom some litigation and some negotiations are still continuing between Eskom and themselves, and a plethora of others, and have been feeding off the Eskom situation itself. There certainly needs to be a separation, in my view, between the state and the party, and hopefully we will move more in that direction in the coming years. So, ascribing everything and every problem to a political organization, rather than having the sense of responsibility that accompanies the CEO's position, which says, I am also going to do my bit to ensure that corruption on the scale that I find it will not be allowed to continue on my watch, to the extent that I can, within the resources and capabilities I have, am able to do so. Is corruption costing Eskom $1 billion a month? I don't know. I haven't done the accounting. But this is not a new revelation, as I've indicated. I've stated publicly, as I've indicated earlier on today, that Mpumalanga is certainly a crime scene. There are lots of actors, both outside of Eskom and within Eskom, who are collaborating to undermine procurement and other processes, supply counterfeit parts, do a poor job in terms of maintenance of units when they have outages, and All of that is done to ensure that they get more work at the end of the day and make more money. And the relentless greed that drives people in this direction continues on an unmitigated basis. And this is what we've been trying to deal with since 2019. And as I've said before, there's no one action that is going to stop these things from happening. It requires a huge collective effort in order to counter the forces of corruption in the situation we find ourselves in. Then the old board and the new board. Why did it take so long to appoint a new board? It is regrettable, but true, even today, that skilled professionals and experienced business people whose skills are collectively required on boards of SOEs so that they are run properly, and we have people on boards who actually understand the business that they are supposed to be governing through board structures, do not want to be associated with SOEs. They believe that their reputations will be tarnished, that they don't want to be part of the casualties that, as other honest professionals have been in the past, particularly in the state capture period. So finding people of the right caliber, with the right integrity, and with the right public orientation in terms of the national interest is not an easy task. And this we have found in recent times as well. So many of the financially skilled people, for example, balance out their own reputational risk against what corruption and state capture has done to a particular institution. And that has been a factor as well in terms of the availability of people. And of course, there have been delays within government processes. So it's easy to say, you know, Minister so-and-so is not doing his job. But there are complex processes that go into identifying, scrutinizing, engaging with, and finally appointing a board. And I certainly do wish that we had taken a shorter time to arrive to the point where we are today. But I do believe that the board that we have appointed since about October last year has all the capabilities required, and in particular, we've tried to ensure that, and not tried to, but we have ensured that there are 4 engineers on that board who understand the engineering business, who understand the energy situation, and together with accounting and other professionals, they make a good combination that we look forward to making a valuable contribution to finally turning Eskom's fortunes around. Then there's the issue of micromanaging. Regrettably, I'm not an engineer. I was trained as a pharmacist. So how do I give engineering instructions to workers in a power station and say, use this bolt, don't use that, use this spanner, don't use that, work at this level of utilization of a unit, but not that level of utilization of a unit. So unfortunately, I have to categorize this as absolute nonsense. There's no micromanaging. I think here what we have is a CEO who thought he was a know-all, and he certainly hadn't worked in a power station situation before. So I refute any assertion and allegation about giving instructions. I'm told that there's somewhere I instructed a middle manager at Coburg, for example. I don't know anybody at Coburg to give instructions to. So why go and perpetrate, in this instance, a particular lie in order to undertake whatever character assassination this individual thinks he is engaged in. But at the same time, as a shareholder, I have not been shy to ask tough questions about how things work, why they don't work, what are the problems at a particular power station when units collapse, why is the EAF been declining over the 3-year period during the stint of this particular CEO, and there is nothing wrong with that, because I'm required to give explanations, whether it is to Parliament or to the public, about what goes on in this situation. So if tough questions can't be answered, then it says something about the capability of individuals. But Eskom has really good professionals who understand their business, who, if given an opportunity, can actually rise to the occasion. And I found my interactions with them and the department's interactions with them extremely valuable in understanding the constraints they work with, but also the possibilities that they have. And many of them are lateral thinkers as well, who think outside the box and who have solutions, but it would appear nobody lends an ear to them in a way in which there's a collection of ideas of different individuals and their wisdom and their experience to benefit Eskom, but also benefit South Africa as a whole. It is also true, Chairperson, excuse me, that elevated levels of load shedding necessitate that the shareholder, where it is appropriate in terms of the memorandum of incorporation, has to intervene to find out what is going on. So in December last year, it became fairly public that Eskom was saying it has difficulty in acquiring diesel. The acting DG on my right, another colleague of hers, and I got directly involved in trying to A, find diesel, B, check its availability, C, check its pricing, D, check the Eskom accounts to see if they had 1.3 or 1.4 billion rands available. E, make sure that that money went into spending on the diesel. F, looked at the logistics of the delivery of that diesel. Is that micromanaging and intervening? Yes. But we didn't manage the power station. We managed the procurement. We didn't even manage it. We facilitated the procurement of diesel. And we were simply arguing with Petro SA, which argument continues till today, that the premium that Petro SA adds to the cost price of diesel means that if they remove that premium, more diesel can in fact be used, more power can be generated from the OCGTs, and therefore possibly a level of load shedding could be avoided as a consequence as well. So if somebody is upset about that, bit of bad luck, because it was in the public interest to do whatever was done, but it was done with the full knowledge of some people that the acting DG was interacting with at Eskom, and similarly with Petro SA as well. Similarly, the acting DG in February 2023 had to, inverted commas, push Eskom to sign off on what is called a standard offer. And you'll remember the announcement by the President that wherever possible, and if megawatts are available, for example, in the Southern African power pool, we should acquire those megawatts as quickly as possible. But there's a long bureaucratic process, both outside of Eskom and within Eskom, that was delaying the acquisition of megawatts from Botswana and Zambia. It was only, 364 megawatts at that stage, but 360 megawatts is better than what some of the units in the power stations at some of the plants deliver. So we assisted in that regard as well. To sum it up, I'm an engaged and vigilant shareholder representative, and certainly not a passive one. My responsibility is to the public of South Africa, and of course must operate within the codes of corporate governance, but at the same time, it is important that what has to be done in order to mitigate load shedding must be done without necessarily micromanaging, but rather acting as an active facilitator to get these things done. So one would suggest very plainly and emphatically that there was no micromanaging as far as I am concerned. Eskom, of course, doesn't operate as an island in the South African situation. It is a key element in a complex ecosystem that involves regulators, that involves private producers, it involves its own plant, and it involves a policy department, let alone the law enforcement and other agencies as well. And facilitation of the right kind of cooperation amongst all parts of that ecosystem is absolutely important. So in plain terms, so that the public understands me clearly, there was no interference with the work of the CEO or of any senior manager at Eskom. And if that is the excuse that is being used in books or interviews for the lack of performance, then it's a pitiful excuse to be utilized. Let me then move on to apparently a statement made by the previous interim chair of the previous board, Professor Makgoba, that I had approved intelligence gathering. And implicitly or otherwise, he was suggesting I gave approval for what is turning out to be a problematic 50 million rand project initiated by the CEO. So firstly, I refute what Professor Makgoba is saying. With great respect to him, he's got it absolutely wrong. And I'll come back to some of those issues just now. Secondly, when I say to someone who says to me, last night a cable which is that thick was cut, and it sends me a photograph of it, I will say, well, can we get more information? Who's responsible for that area? How could a thick cable like that be cut to sabotage a particular part of the power station and cause a unit or two to fail? That is information about a specific incident that took place. It's not about go around and go and do the job of the South African intelligence services, whichever branch it is that we are referring to. So in that sense, Professor Makgoba is misleading and misinforming Scopa and the public as well. As far as the so-called Derator project is concerned, that he did not discuss the project with me at any length. He merely in passing, and I'll give you the chronology of events in a moment, said, I'm doing this because the law enforcement guys are not coming to the party. And I'm not using Eskom money, I'm raising the money privately, and I've told the chair about it. What he told the chair, I don't know. But today we discover that the project actually started in January 2022. The interaction I'm talking about happened sometime late in June or July 2022, 6 months later. So he was operating on his own free will, so to speak, on this project. And of course, at the same time, it seems he was writing a book as well, rather than focusing on his job of keeping the power stations going and providing electricity to South Africa. So for 6 months, I didn't know anything about this project, nor did I know anything about the details of what he was up to. So it was just mentioned in passing. His was not a request for approval, because I was neither asked nor did I give it. And therefore, this was an initiative of his own. And today, it's clear that the business sector provided some or all of 50 million rands, although there's some differences about who provided what number at what stage. I also had no knowledge of the BLSA, of the fact that BLSA was funding this project until it became publicly disclosed in recent days and weeks. To the extent that I'm aware, there were no reports to the Eskom board, either the previous one or the current one, and nothing was placed before the risk committee, audit committee, or any other structure of the Eskom board as well. There's certainly no correspondence that we've received in the department in this particular regard as well. Then comes the question, what did you know? What I was shown was a diagram with a whole lot of names on it. And I am being asked, and I'm sure some of my colleagues here are going to do that shortly, Chairperson, who are these people? So my answer is a very simple one. And I'm going to actually start with what some media houses have adopted as their stance, which is an encouraging sign, and then come back to what I want to say. So on the 5th of March 2023, News 24, which has published any number of articles in relation to what is going on at Eskom, and obviously they had some privileged information provided to them, say in an editorial the following: the recent leak of intelligence files from a private investigation initiated by the director has piqued, PIQED, renewed interest in the gangs looting Eskom. Many of the allegations about the sabotage of power stations have been investigated and published on News 24 over the past 2 years. Allegations of the involvement of politicians as overlords in this grand scheme have been swirling around for years. Without tangible evidence that will withstand judicial scrutiny, there is no point speculating who these politicians may be. We all have our suspicions, but without solid proof, they will remain just that. So, Chairperson, I'm not going to implicate or smear the reputations of others without credible evidence and verifiable facts being provided. Intelligence dossiers, as some of you might remember, have done a great deal of harm and immeasurable damage to our country and to its institutions, and, by the way, to individuals like Johan Boysen as well in the past. In fact, I was the target of a so-called intelligence report in early 2017, after which I was fired as Minister of Finance, so I know personally what I'm talking about. I was not given any copy of any report of the investigation. I cannot mention the names of people, as the investigation was not complete as I understood it, and in fact I was told that this was preliminary information, but certainly not evidence. Furthermore, it would seem to me that there were weekly reports that the director received from this project. So I would ask that SCOPA request the director or the people who conducted the investigation, or those who might have had subsequent access to these reports, to provide details or names of individuals. The basis for me knowing the names is discredited, and this investigation also stands to be approached skeptically and discredited as well, as some of the allegations or information cannot be verified and is untested at this particular point in time. Let me conclude, Chair, by saying the following. One of the questions apparently that is being raised is you knew about corruption and what did you do? So part of those two files that we've sent to the committee indicate some of the actions taken. I'll just run through the heads of that. Firstly, as soon as we settled into the DPE, after the appointment in March 2018, I in fact asked for some staff to be set aside and for them to collect all the forensic investigation reports from all the SOEs and assemble them in a special room that we set aside for all of these reports. I then decided on legal advice that the SIU is requested to review the forensic reports and take appropriate actions, and Advocate Makhobe, who's here, can verify that. The SIU conducted a review of 22 forensic reports covering the period 1 April 2015 to 31 March 2018, and obviously there were many more subsequently, to assess, monitor, and follow up on implementation of recommendations that were made arising from those investigations. The department's evaluation of the reports confirmed that some were not fully implemented. A service provider was appointed to verify an additional 245 forensic reports covering the period 1 April 2010 to 31 March 2019 to assess whether the reports predating the coverage period of the verifications were implemented. Subsequently, there have been several SIU proclamations with respect to various SOEs, and that led to a whole lot of actions. I can detail them a little later, but to give you a taste for one or two, the SIU launched investigations into 14 coal transportation service providers concerning payments from 2010 to 2021, that's 31st of January 2021. As a consequence, 5 employees were suspended, 1 resigned during the interview with the investigating team, and 1 resigned prior to commencement of the investigation. There's several other examples here. The SIU has referred 5,620 matters to Eskom for institution of disciplinary proceedings, for failure to submit financial declarations, which are integral to the process of preventing and detecting conflicts of interest. 135 for failing to declare or get approval for doing work outside of Eskom. 10 officials red flagged through lifestyle audits. 10 officials referred through whistleblower reports, and so on. Eskom itself, from the time of the late Jabu Mabuza, took its own initiatives. Contracts were cancelled as a result, again, of SIU's investigations. A contract of 6.9 billion rands with a particular company, building contracts to the value of 4.1 billion rands, and this totals to approximately 11 billion rands. Contracts declared invalid by the courts, again 3.7 billion rands. Savings or losses prevented. There was a setting aside of a contract for 2.6 billion rands. Cancellation of another contract, 5.5 billion rands, a building contract dispute that was settled for 400 million rands, and of course you're familiar with the ABB situation and the monies that they've paid both here and in the US as fines. Evidence referred to assisted Eskom in defending contractor claims before the Dispute Arbitration Board, and this resulted, if I just take a quick count, a total of about 3.4 billion rands being saved. Next, we implemented the state capture report, required all boards to develop action plans, which they themselves have to implement, and there's a team within DPE that is monitoring the implementation of these reports. And we also appointed a legal team led by a senior counsel to assist the department in taking action and implementing recommendations, where contracts amounting to 14.7 billion rands were subject to state capture would be dealt with. Approximately 4.8 billion rands is being claimed against SAP. That's not South African Police, that's a technology company, PwC, the auditors, and former directors of Eskom. Eskom and SIU successfully recovered 2 billion rands unlawfully played, and I think you've covered that in some of your work in Scopa earlier on as well. The DP is currently finalizing consultations with the company's registration office with a view to imminently launch directed delinquency proceedings against 13 former directors of Eskom. 25 names of former senior executives of Eskom have been identified for inclusion into a centralized database of individuals dismissed for their involvement in state capture or who resigned from Eskom to avoid accountability for state capture. So that's the first part, Chair, and some evidence of what we did. The second part is I've also played an active part after repeated sense of frustration being expressed by the CEO at the lack of movement from law enforcement entities. And it is in this regard that I consulted with Professor Mufamadi and asked for his advice and assistance in trying to address some of the concerns that have been arising from incidents at Eskom, which only, of course, the CEO knew about. And in particular, this would involve investigations of criminality and vandalism that have occurred at Eskom as far back as 2019. State capture and corruption has rendered the institutional dysfunctional, as I said, and Mpumalanga province manifestly, as I said earlier on, a crime scene. The consultation with Professor Mufamadi was based on his ability to convene the relevant authorities concerned with the backing of the authority of the presidency so that priority investigations can get the necessary attention. And the law enforcement work stream of NECOM is now taken over much of this work and is providing an integrated basis upon which, and I think some numbers have been made public in this regard, corrupt individuals or instances of corruption or sabotage or any other form of damage to plant are in fact being pursued. So as I said, the professor would be able to mobilize support for these investigations, and that should lead to some fruition or conclusion once that mobilization actually occurred. But I believe the professor will be addressing you, and he can speak for himself when he actually does so. Finally, let me say very clearly that I stand totally opposed to corruption, and where it was within my scope or ability to play a role in assisting Eskom to combat corruption, I have done so. Where it was within our powers as a department to assist Eskom in relation to one or other regulatory constraint being removed, we've tried to do so as well. Where it was possible, after much dialogue with the Treasury, but also the intervention of the President, to enable the country to take the Eskom debt or part of the debt onto its own books. That has been done to assist Eskom as well. But I think the CEO has done two things that should be noteworthy. First, the contract that he signed as a self-proclaimed champion of corporate governance and as the only person in town who understands the role of various institutions and people within a corporate governance context. There's a clause 15 in his contract that he signed when he was employed as CEO, which requires confidentiality in terms of the affairs of the institution that he served. In no big institution like Eskom in the private sector would you have a CEO who has left for whatever reason going and writing chapter and verse about events that have been taking place within the company itself. But secondly, he seems to have remembered for some reason, in particular the 1980s, and taken the country back to Swat Kafar tactics by labeling all of us as communists, as people who are mindless, as people for whom the hammer and sickle must be drawn in our parking bays, which is the worst insult that anyone can cast on South Africans who want this country to work, who want Eskom to work, who want load shedding to end, and who want to mobilize capacity within Eskom, within government, and within society as a whole in order to make sure that the right things are done. Thank you, Chair, for your patience.
Right. Thank you very much, Minister.